Thanks for hanging out. I love this. It's so good because when Dave got started, I was super stressed out because at the very beginning I leaned over to Drew and I said, he's going to use my material. He's going to talk about what I'm going to talk about. And then he didn't. He just gave the best intro ever to what I want to talk about, here in this workshop. And you know, this is one of those topics. I know if you actually knew what this was and you signed up for it, it was one of those things that was very difficult for me to even think about putting on like a workshop thing, especially when we're talking about being spirit-filled. And it seemed like this very unspiritual topic, you know, like we're going to talk about getting things done and that sort of thing. And I just want to explain a couple of things that, first of all, it's something that as I was praying about, when Drew said, hey, we'd love for you to do something, you know, just whatever you want to bring it. As I was praying, I just was really landed on something tangible and something very practical. It just was definitely the thing. I can talk about all sorts of cultural ideas. I can talk about all sorts of philosophical ideas, but I felt like for whatever reason, I was supposed to bring something very practical, something very tangible for leading in the local church. And so if there is this tendency to think this is a little bit unspiritual, just understand that this was prayed through and definitely thought through very well, and certainly something that I felt was what we were supposed to talk about during this time. And then when Dave got started, it was just even more evident. I think this is a well-timed thing. I want to explain before I dive into what I want to talk about. And so I'm gonna explain a couple of things in a few minutes. Talk about a couple of different ideas. 3 sort of distinct ideas that have to do with leadership. 2 of them sort of organizational. 1 of them very personal. Before I get that, just a little brief story for me. I think context really helps a lot. But I have been on a really insane 22-year journey of ministry. It's just have been all over the map, including planting a church in Brooklyn 12 or 13 years ago. I planted a church in Brooklyn Heights. It was the greatest experience in ministry that I've ever had. It still is the greatest experience I've ever had. It was the hardest experience I ever had, and it absolutely gutted me. Wound up considering it a failure, moved out of the city, spent a couple of years trying to recover from that, trying to recover spiritually from that experience. Definitely the desert season that Dave was talking about. It was going into a season where everything got stripped. Everything I knew about ministry, everything I thought that was we were supposed to do, everything, how God worked, my theology was rocked. And I spent a couple of years in this sort of desert place. And then after a couple of years of licking my wounds, a friend of mine pastored a really large church, about 5,000 people on a typical weekend. I had been on his teaching team, so I taught about once a month there. And he invited me to join his staff. And so for me, I made the decision to enter back into some sort of vocational ministry, because up until that time, I was bitter and angry, and I didn't want to take a check from a church ever again. That was where I was. I had issues. I'll just say that. I had baggage issues, serious issues with church. I'm going to this big church, and I remember thinking to myself, they have more money on lights than an urban church planter has in their entire year budget. And it just pissed me off. I just be honest, I would get so angry, and I'd be like, God, why do you fund this and you won't fund that? You know, I was really toxic for a while. But I went back on staff at this guy's church and really felt like it was the Lord calling me there. The idea was that I would take over. It would be a transition, so I was going to be the heir apparent, going to be moving into his position, pass the baton sort of thing. And we're about 18 months into it, and I realized I don't want to do this. It was the epitome of the seeker model, big church in America. I mean, it's everything. You know, they're cutting studio albums and doing all their stuff. And I remember sitting in my office and thinking, I don't want to do this. I don't want to lead this sort of community of faith. This isn't what I signed up for. And it began another journey for me of well, now what? And interestingly enough, I finally approached the senior pastor, and we sat down together, and I said, his name's Joe. I said, Joe, I don't know how to say this, but I don't think I'm supposed to take over for you. And he looked at me and he goes, that's kind of good because I don't know that I'm done yet. And I was like, I get it. Both of us were in this tension. And I said, I don't know what this means. I don't know that I'm leaving. I just know that this isn't it. I know that I'm not supposed to take this on. That was on a Friday. And on Monday, a pastor of this particular church in our community approached him and said, I've been the interim pastor for 2 years, and I think it's time for me to pass the baton to somebody else to lead this church. Interestingly enough, this church was a church that was across the street from my house. They were renting a Seventh-day Adventist congregation's building for the last 14 years. I could throw a baseball from my front porch and roll it up onto the doorstep. That's how close it was to my house. Not only that, when I was kind of a young guy in ministry, I first heard about church planting. Somebody told the story of church planting, and you'll laugh at this. But this particular church was started with 300 people, and on their first Sunday, there were 600 people. And I remember, like, if that's planting a church, I could do that, right? Like, who couldn't do that, right? Like, looking back, I was like, well, that's what church planting is. But this was the first story of a church plant that I'd ever heard. The problem was that this church had been in 14 consecutive years of decline. And so they came to me and said, hey, if it's not this, what about this? And so I started praying, and I think it took like 30 seconds of prayer to realize this was in my neighborhood, and I'd had a burden for my neighborhood. We'd had non-believers coming to us and saying, hey, if you guys ever started a church in our neighborhood, we'd go to church. That's a sign. That's like a groundswell thing that says, maybe we should be doing something in our neighborhood, right? And so we prayed about it, and literally, I mean, it didn't take, truly 24 hours, we knew the answer. Like, we're supposed to go to this dysfunctional, broken, 14 years of decline church that was the opposite of everything in my experience. I grew up in a church of 8,000, on staff at churches of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. I mean, that was like, my experience was big church world, and now I'm going to take over a church, 14 years of decline. It was a revolving door. In the 14 years of its existence, over 10,000 people had come and gone from the church. And they'd gone from somewhere around 700 at one point down to 200 individuals, including kids, when I moved into this position. And I remember thinking to myself, what have I done? The reason I was doing it was everything that Dave was talking about. I was just at this point of saying, like, what are we really doing in the church? Like, what is this really all about? Like, are we just building stadiums and gathering people as spectators to like watch other people perform the gospel? Or are we really going to live the gospel out in community? And so, to be honest with you, what happened for me was the things that were birthed in Brooklyn began to be lived out years later now in this place. And so God suddenly like opened the floodgates and said, would you just lean into this thing that I've been doing in you? And I remember being there a few months, and they had a little house that they'd bought for our offices. And I remember this one particular day, like realizing this was very different. I didn't know exactly what to do. And I had this moment. I remember sitting, my office was one of the bedrooms in this house, and I remember sitting in my chair, staring back at the ceiling, and I just said, God, I want to lead this church to be the best expression of what you want for your people, whether one more person ever comes or whether one more dollar ever gets given. Like, if we are this number of people, and this is the amount of money we have to work with the rest of our existence as a church, I believe that you have more for us. I believe that you want to accomplish something in us as a church. I believe there's a vision that we can fulfill whether or not there is not one more person or not one more dollar. And so I really, like, for me, settled this whole like nickels and noses thing. Like, I like to say that there's more to church than nickels and noses. And that tends to be, like Dave said, that tends to be the metric, right? Nickels and noses. And so I found myself in that moment then digging down, because I remember thinking this. I thought, if the kingdom of Jesus is about nickels and noses, then the NFL does the kingdom of Jesus better than anybody else, right? Because there are more people in stadiums on Sunday, and there's more money in the NFL than there is in churches. And so you just realize, wait a second, like, if that's what it's about, if it's about butts and seats and dollars in offering plates, then the NFL is crushing it for Jesus, right? So I found myself just wrestling. So what is this? Like, what is it that we're really doing? And so I found myself trying to define what was, and for lack of a better term, and this is something I think I applied later on, but what was a win? Like, what was the win for us? Like, if I was looking at the scoreboard of our church, and it wasn't about how many people attended on a Sunday, or it wasn't how much money we had, what was a real, genuine win? And so this is like the first of three things that I want to share with you. And this is why I just want to say this is not something that's an organizational leadership tip or trick. This is like out of my heart, just like, Lord, what do you really want us to do? And the first thing I said was, there need to be stories of life change. That was the number one thing, that there'd be stories of life change. And by the way, I don't have a handout because there's journals, and I write my own notes, so you can just do whatever, and if you want me to repeat something, I will. But we just said our number one measurement, and when I say we, it was like me and the Holy Spirit, because that's about all there was at this point. Because I was thinking team, even though there wasn't one, it's like, okay, I know there's a team out there. It's just me and a couple of part-time people hanging out. But I just remember like this one thing was stories of life change. That's the number one metric. Like that's what we can measure. Are we hearing stories of people whose lives are genuinely being impacted by the gospel? The reason that I said that way was that I recognized that there was more going on than just people coming to Christ as well. There were people in this church that I realized hadn't grown in decades. You know, they'd been stagnating. And so I wanted to see life change in the existing community. I wanted to see life change of people coming, you know, like all these different things. I knew that we needed to be hearing stories, and there were no stories. 14 years, I mean, this church, all they knew how to do was lose people and credibility. That was like basically their story in our community. And so that was the number one metric. The second metric was this, that whatever we did, whatever we were involved with, that people would be talking about it, that they would be excited about it, that there'd be this sense of like something's up. One of the things, yeah, go ahead. People in the community. Yeah, good question. People in the community. In fact, that it sort of motivated this thinking. Early on, I made the decision that I wanted us to be a church that if we disappeared, our community would know we were gone. That if you know something happened and we evaporated, that the people in our city would say, we don't know how to do life now that you're gone. We were so far from that. At this point in time, like when we first started, literally, people thought the church had closed 4 years earlier when there was a pastoral transition. People didn't know the church existed. And so thinking about like, could our community actually tell stories about what we're doing? Is that something that could actually happen, that we would hear people do that? It would be an amazing thing. And then the third thing is that we would see people released to their kingdom vision. Not just serving the church, but that we saw people engaging the kingdom of Jesus inside and outside the walls of a church, that we saw people truly living out a kingdom sense of purpose, like they understood what they were called to, whether it was vocational or bivocational or whatever, that they just knew that they were doing what God made them for. So those were the three things. And so this is basically what for the last 7 years has been the measurement. And I share that because it's a measurement that we were able to use it right away. Like it was something that didn't matter if there was 200 people, which I know that seems large in a city sense, but in a suburban area where there's churches of 5,000, we were small potatoes, you know. But there was something about, wait a second, now if we have one story of life change, that's a win, you know? Like if there's one person who discovers what they were called to in life, like that's a win. And so we just began measuring based on that and said, that's the goal, man. That's like anytime we get together, anytime we think about what we're doing, that's what we're really looking for. And so the way that we actually measure that is we talk about it. When I say we have a team now. Back in the early days, literally just a few people that were gathering. I'm mostly volunteers. And I just made the point, we're going to tell stories. We're going to talk about these things that are actually happening. I love, Drew sends me emails every now and then of updates on what's happening at Hope. And this is one thing I've noticed with Drew. Every single time, just about, he sends me a story of somebody whose life has been changed. And I'm always like, yes, that's it, right? Because if we're hearing stories of life change, that gets me out of bed the next day, right? That allows me to keep plowing forward. And so for us, we just celebrate that constantly. So even today, we gather as a team, as a staff, and every time we get together, I just simply say, somebody tell me a story. And our team just knows, like everybody comes, they're like excited because there's this sense of when we get together as a team, we're all going to share the crazy stuff that's going on in people's lives in this one environment. And I just recently, I asked one of our staff members, I said, is this working? Like, is it really like, you know, I've been doing this and, you know, I'm jabber and I get excited about this. And she looked at me and she said, every time a story is told, it reminds me that the most mundane thing I'm involved with at Summit matters and that I'm making a difference, even with the most mundane thing. She said, my favorite thing we do is tell stories of life change. It's just been an incredible thing for us to be able to sit back and say, okay, what is the genuine win? And we don't have to grow and we don't have to have any more money to see any of those things actually take place. Interestingly enough, and this is kind of the way it works, I removed from my heart the need to grow and we grew. So that sort of leads to the next thing that I want to talk about. Before I do that, questions or thoughts about this first piece of this?
Did you just say you removed from your heart the need to grow?
Yeah. I got over it, man, the whole church growth thing, because I noticed the same thing that Dave was talking about. You know, And I coach a lot of church planters today, and basically what I'm always saying is, if we just keep doing what we did in the 90s, all we're doing is just shifting people from church to church, right? We're just moving people around. And so for me, it was fundamentally because I was noticing that church growth was really just church transfer. And so I was just in this, really reactionary space, but also for my own heart, I needed to not find my validation in the approval of men, which is ultimately what numbers are all about. It's, do people approve of your message? Because when they don't approve, they leave and take their checkbooks with them. And sometimes Jesus says things that people don't approve of. So, so I just had to root that out. Good question. Yeah.
So I've heard, the phrase that culture trumps vision and all that. So how does this culture support your existing written vision, mission, or how does it not?
That is the perfect transition to the second thing I want to talk about. So, go ahead.
You can pay me later.
Before you transition, I might have missed this, but we tell stories of life change.
Yeah.
Corporately,
Mm-hmm.
do you tell that story on a regular basis? Is there like a steady diet of life change stories on Sunday, corporately? Through what medium? Videos, testimonies?
We don't do a lot of it on Sunday.
Okay.
And here's why. Because we do have a lot of seekers, really genuine, atheists that come to our church because they know it's safe to ask questions, and they don't want to feel like they're going to be turned into a project. So that's a very careful thing when you're really creating an environment that's welcome to people and you're acknowledging that they're in the room. If they start to see that we're celebrating stories of them changing, they suddenly feel like we've moved them to a project mode and it's a transactional relationship. So we just found ourselves, and this is just where we land. We're in a place that's full of skeptics, and so we're trying to create a skeptic-friendly environment. So the way that we tell those stories is primarily with teams, volunteers, leaders, emails. We did for a while on our website, we did have stories that were being told, but then again, that value of that public thing of people checking us out, it was they're gonna make me one of their pet stories. And so we don't do it that way, but it's mainly just conversationally and through email and through celebration, just celebrating those things with the people that have been involved with them, yeah.
What have you done to help facilitate that people would talk positively about your church? That if we went away, where's the tangible thing?
That's a good question. I probably will kind of address that in this next little section, but we made the decision, and this is sort of a side note, we made the decision that we were not going to start anything that served our community because there were already enough great organizations that did. So we formed affiliate relationships with a few key groups and said, we're going to serve you the best that we possibly can and partner with you the best that we can. We found ourselves, that everybody wants to start their own nonprofit that does what everybody else is doing. That's basically what we said. And we're like, well, these guys, we've got amazing people. And we felt like we had things to offer them that would help them. We also identified things that existed in our own community of faith that were what I would describe as secret passions because nobody knew that, for example, we had this culture of foster care and adoption and nobody knew. I started talking to people and I realized there were 20 families that were fostering or adopting in this one church of 200 people, not exaggerating. I'm just have you guys ever gotten together and talked about this? So that became one of the first things we did. And kind of a cool tail into this is that the state of Washington last year called us during a foster care shortage. And they said, we don't know what to say other than that every time you talk about foster care, we get more people to sign up and there are more kids in homes. We have a shortage. Can you please do whatever it is you do? Because we need more foster parents right now and you guys are our best source of foster parents. So for me, that was bingo, we won. When the state's calling us to say, can you provide foster care? We won. That's a win, So anything like that. We partner with, we partnered with a school that's right close to us, a program called Bite to Go that was, it sends kids home with food that don't have food for the weekend. Interestingly enough, it's the most affluent elementary school in our city. But there's a bunch of refugee children that are bused into the school because they live in a particular area where there's pretty inexpensive housing that's somehow included because of some developer's zoning. They're included, so nobody was doing anything to meet the needs of these kids except the school, but there was this conflict. For example, they did a coat drive. So all the rich kids brought their coats, and then all the kids that needed coats showed up the next day at school, and all the rich kids were saying, well, why are you wearing my coat, man? Like, what's going on? Why are you doing it? And so they didn't realize their parents had given their coats away. And so the school was experiencing this tension. Meanwhile, people were like offering to help, and they were saying, no, we're like the richest school. We don't need help. We don't need help. We stepped in and said, no, we think you need help. And today, their school counselor, their principal, their vice principal, they are like singing our praises all the time. Like, we don't know what we do without you guys, because we bridged that gap. We allowed people to connect in a way and meet, even parents to meet needs, but now through us. So it doesn't look like this sort of dysfunctional thing inside their own school. So that's just the stuff we began to try to do, is partner in those ways. And they really started small. I mean, really small. Like, just what can we do? Like, it was packing boxes of food. We didn't provide the food. We didn't provide the boxes, and because we didn't have any money. You know, we were just saying, if we don't have money, what do we do? So, yeah. So, how did it support the vision? We kind of got moving in this, and so the church, we started growing. So we started growing, and I realized like we needed more. Like, as people began to get more involved, we got more volunteers, started hiring some people. I will say, just so you know, the complicated nature of it, we've grown from 200 people to about 2,000 people in the last 6 years. 800 people this last year alone. Just it's been like it's the worst thing to complain about. It's been the most complicated thing in the world. Beautiful and good, but it's been this crazy thing. So these things continue to be what drive us for the win, but at some point I realized we needed more than just this. And our mission and vision, like, it's really cool to have a great mission and vision, but at the end of the day I found myself saying, this doesn't help us on Monday, you know, like, found myself saying, like, what are we really doing to make this stuff happen? So when you asked just a moment ago, like, how do we make people celebrate us in the community? How did that actually happen? There was for me no way that I could actually look at our team and say, like, what are we doing? And even toward Dave's end, what he was talking about, like thinking creatively and thinking outside of the box, like, what do we actually do? And so that led us to develop what I call 5 strategic anchors. And I'm going to share these with you, and I'm going to share these knowing that this is not an exhaustive list. I don't know that this isn't going to change for us in the days ahead. We may be in a season where some of this is shifting for us a little bit. I don't ever say this thinking that this is what churches are supposed to do. This is what our church discerned we were supposed to do. This is when we said strategically, what are the things that we anchor ourselves to that we're actually about? This is the stuff that in this season we said. So I'm just simply sharing with you the idea of strategic anchors. And if you like 1 or 2 of them, great. But I implore you to discover them for yourselves and what your community of faith has as anchors. But this is basically what they are, and I'll share them really briefly. For example, and there's no priority to these, we exist to create environments where individuals can engage in gospel community. So for us, it was identifying that people didn't need friendship, they needed gospel community, which is a clear definition. So each one of these has a little paragraph that defines it. I'm careful to not give you all of that stuff. But we just said we actually can't make gospel community happen. All we can do is create the environment. We can create the structures. We can facilitate the processes to make that a reality, but we can't force it on somebody. So we create the environment where that could take place. We provide resources and tools for people to grow in their personal faith so that it impacts all of their life, how they work, how they play, how they lead their families, how they live in their neighborhoods. We give people tools and resources. So again, and I'll unpack all of these in just a moment. Again, we provide the resource. We provide the tools. Another one for us is we create environments where people can have genuine encounters with the living God. We don't make the encounter happen. We can't manipulate that. But we do facilitate an environment where people can have a genuine experience and know that God is real. Know that God's speaking to them. We use that vague terminology for a reason, and I'll unpack it in a second. Another one is, trying to think about how exactly we word this one. I think, again, we provide resources and opportunities for individuals to grow in their leadership and their kingdom purpose. So genuinely thinking through how are we getting people to live towards that 3rd win, very specifically, like how are we getting people to live out what God's called them to do in their lives. The fifth one is the one that's usually most offensive to church people. The fifth one is we run a good business. So those are our 5 anchors. And those things are intentionally vague for a reason. And it goes to what Dave was talking about in terms of creativity. We look at those, and our whole thinking with it is to not think about the mechanics of church. This is what we actually do. So the way we started this is I would just look at the people that were serving alongside of us, our teams, and I said, this is what we do Monday through Friday, right? Like if you want to think about Sunday, let's just get Sunday out of our heads because I needed them to think outside of the Sunday box. This is just what we do, right? We're just providing these tools and providing these resources. We're providing these opportunities. So let's think of new delivery systems. Let's think of new ways to make this happen. Let's think of new ways to talk about this. So we recognize that there was a certain amount of we were removed from this in a particular way. Like God is working in ways that we're not in control of. I don't get to manipulate how God's showing up in people's lives, but I do have control over the environment, the tools, and the resources. And so it really helped us focus and think, okay, so what are we actually providing? What are we actually doing? So there's this intentional vagueness to say we want to think outside the box with this. We want people to have experiences with God, but we're not saying that has to happen on a Sunday morning right after worship and right before the message, there's this ministry time, whatever. Like, we're just like thinking to ourselves, like, how do we actually give people those encounters? And it may be that it's somehow sitting by a tree in a park somewhere, and we've provided something in their hands, and they're encountering the God of creation in a way they never have before. So we're just thinking like all of these different ways all the time. So I'll actually give you 3 ways that we use these. First of all, and this I just kind of unpacked this, we just dream. So we take our strategic anchors and we dream. The only one we don't dream about is how to run a good business. That one, by the way, is just, it's a credibility thing in our community. If we don't run our organization well, if we are not like a top leading organization, we lose credibility in our city. So we are in the middle of, the heart of the most affluent, most educated, most liberal community in our city. And so we have to have that credibility of running a good business. Like that's just imperative for us. So just so you know, that's why that one's there. It also, it's like an integrity thing too. So we should run good businesses. We should be good with resources, which then again relates back to these anchors. So other than that one, we use these to dream. So we just spend time, a couple of times a year, we just spend time dreaming about this. We spend time thinking like, what could we do? Like, what if? We try stuff. When Dave said, fail fast and fail often, we try stuff. We call it piloting. I use the word pilot program all the time because people in churches get married to ideas. If you use the word pilot, it's like, oh yeah, we'll try this. We'll see if it works. We've had pilots run for 3 years and then kill them, and everyone's like fine with it. Yeah, we were just trying stuff. I'm like, whew, like we dodged a bullet because that was a straight up program at that point, right? So we pilot things, and some things work and some things don't. We have a really open culture of like, we don't get too excited about any one idea. Because we're not dreaming about the program, we're dreaming about that anchor itself. And so we're just thinking through, is this happening? And we're gonna throw stuff at it until it actually is taking place. And if it works, it's great. If it doesn't work, we're fine with it because we weren't stuck on this program being the end all. In fact, we've been surprised by things. We've had things work, and we're like, we've done events where like 110 people show up for a 2-day workshop. And when the leaders asked me what I thought, how many people would be there, there's this one, I said 16. And we had over 100 people show up for this workshop, and I was like, I think there'll be 16 people. And I wasn't even there. I get a phone call. They're like, you underestimated, and we're hosed right now. like, oh man. So that we realized right there, that worked. That was like one way for us to deliver tools and resources that worked way better than anything else. We tried that with another thing, and we thought there'd be 100 people, and we had 13 people show up. Interestingly enough, those 13 people signed up for a follow-up class that lasted 10 weeks, and not one of them missed the next 10 weeks. And we were like, okay, that's interesting. So we're just always looking at these different things we're trying and saying, okay, that worked with this topic, with this tool, with this part of people's lives we're trying to disciple into. Here's where that sort of thing happened. We're also really pleasantly surprised by certain things. So we're just dreaming, if that's really clear. The second thing we're doing is evaluating. I'm actually going to draw just for a minute. We evaluate based on our anchors, and I just, this is not original by any means, but we talk about our anchors like the stays on a barrel. And essentially what we've determined is that our capacity to accomplish our vision and our mission is limited by our lowest barrel stay or our lowest strategic anchor. So the capacity of this barrel is basically equal to whatever this lowest stay is. So we find ourselves looking around saying, okay, so what, of these different areas, of these 5 areas, and usually it's the 4 that we're focusing on the most, of those 4 things, which is the one that's lagging right now? And we have really honest conversations around this. And here's what's been challenging. We have really great weekend services. I'll just say, like, I've got a great worship pastor and a great team, and we have a fun space, it's like a great place to meet. And I would say that like we get about 95% of what I want to see us doing, maybe even 99% of what I want to see us doing on a Sunday, people encountering God literally in our midst. Like, it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. I would go to my church, I actually took a sabbatical 2 years ago, and I snuck in the back, and I was like, I'd go here. Like, I love our church, and like God is moving in our midst. When it comes down to doing budgets every year, which we're doing right now, it's really frustrating for my worship pastor and all the people doing things around Sunday morning, because we don't allocate more money to things that are above this efficiency line. So he can present this budget and say, man, we want to do this, and we want to have all these different things. But if we're hurting and we're not raising and releasing leaders, if we don't have leadership development really happening in our church, we're not spending, the only money we're going to spend on worship gear is to fix the stuff that breaks. That's it. So we evaluate this and basically say, what's our lowest one? Then we focus our dreaming. We focus organizationally. We'll also do this. So for example, if raising leaders is our strategic anchor, we say, okay, so let's look at all the different things that we're doing. How do we raise the temperature of raising leaders in all of these different areas? And so we bring everybody to the table. So this also keeps us from being siloed as an organization. So now we're bringing people, and it's not just Brad saying, we're going to start this leadership development engine over here and develop leaders. I'm looking at our kids director and saying, Lori, how can we begin to raise up leaders? What can we do to start handing off more responsibility to leaders and using our kids ministry to multiply leaders? We did that a couple of years ago and started this thing where we have students that are leading in our kids ministry in a very intentional, very cool way, creating a culture of discipleship in our kids ministry that's now flowing into our student ministries. And it came because we just said, we're not developing leaders, how do we do that? And now we got this cool thing that happened, and by the way, I didn't come up with it. Like, not at all did I come up with it. It was just letting other people dream about, well, if we're not developing leaders, what could we do? And how could we actually kill 2 birds with 1 stone? You always need volunteers in kids ministry, and so we created a leadership development engine that actually like met a specific need that we had because we evaluated this way. So we're evaluating, we're brainstorming across everything that we're doing, thinking about each one of these things and how it actually is happening. And then we're allocating resources, like I said. So at budget time, at resources, like if I'm thinking about making a hire, there's always like the stuff that people think you should hire in a church. Oh, you need somebody to do this. You need somebody to do that. Someone recently asked me, another pastor said, man, you've hired really well, but your staff is really strange. And they're odd people because they work with me, but they're just like we don't look like a typical church staff at all. We only have one person who went to Bible college on our team, and she's my assistant. Everybody else, they were like in marketing. They were in, one of them was a fitness instructor. Like, we have all these like random people from these different things, but it's because when we were looking at what we need to resource, it just allowed us to look at our team very differently, because we weren't looking at, we need to hire an executive pastor, we need to hire a kids director, we didn't look at it in those traditional terms. We were looking for people that fulfilled these anchors for us. And so there's just been this beautiful creative thing that sort of happened out of that. And most of those people are really motivated. So it's easier to train somebody that's motivated than to motivate somebody who's trained. I don't know if you have heard that before, but motivated people just get stuff done. So we evaluate. So there's the dreaming, there's the evaluation, and then there's just this resourcing dynamic where we're making decisions about where we put time, energy, and people based on this. All of that supporting the vision and mission. Here's what's interesting. I spent like 10 years telling church planters, like helping them craft a mission statement, helping them craft a vision statement, helping them identify their values. I don't reference our mission statement hardly ever anymore because of the anchors. Because this is that like wheels in motion thing. Like this is the stuff we're actually doing. Our mission statement has just gotten sort of shorter and larger at the same time. Like releasing the gospel into our city through the lives of individuals. That's basically our mission these days. It is really simple and really small, and it's really big because the nuts and bolts, tangible stuff is coming through these strategic anchors. So questions about that?
Sorry, you said that you staff not based on traditional roles. Can you give us an example of what that would look like, as opposed to a kid director right off the bat? Most church planners are kids and so forth.
Right. Well, and I think maybe the role at the end of the day, we might call them that, and they just don't, but they don't fit into, so that's a great question, because I'm actually thinking about our kids director. Her journey is hilarious. So we got her because we needed somebody up front in front of kids, and she's a fitness instructor, and she's energetic, and so that's why she landed in that, because we were like, we need somebody who's, well, in fact, our first kids director, when I got there, actually came to me when I tried to hire, and she said, I don't like kids. And I said, I know you don't like kids, but you're great at starting things and building teams. So I don't want you to love kids. I want you to love teams, and I want you to build this. So there's kind of a miniature example, like within the role, where I was just thinking differently about it because of our anchors helping me redefine the role. We have somebody, so this is a strange role. We have one person on our team that handles all volunteer applications, all volunteer requests for all of our teams. So one person that it comes through, so that process happens through her. And then because serving is such a huge dynamic to this leadership development piece for us, part of her job is also, we do random surveys of our volunteers, and we ask about their onboarding process, about their continued participation, what's it look like, what's it like to serve. We sort of hired her in a position that she's sort of safe. So someone's not reporting to a team leader. They're not reporting to the person that like leads the worship ministry, the kids ministry. So we just realized we needed somebody that we could get real honest feedback about how we were doing raising leaders. And so we send these monthly evals out, and we get an email. I get an email that says, here's the results of this month's survey of the random 6 people we chose to survey across our ministry to see what their experience is like serving at Summit. And that's a weird thing. I don't know that I haven't met another church that does random surveys of their volunteers. But for us, it was like that. Okay, we need somebody. We also wanted one person who was looking at a person's application, and instead of, traditionally people leading ministries recruit for their ministries. So the worship leader recruits for the worship team, and the children's leader recruits for the children's team. And what we wanted to do was really create an opportunity to help people serve in the way that they were created to. And we created that position around, if we're trying to release people into their kingdom calling, we can't be recruiting them to do a job. We need to actually be processing with them and saying, like, what's God doing in your life? So that person's role is to help people understand, like, hey, let's talk a little bit about like what God's been doing. Tell me your story. Let me hear about things you're passionate about. And we were really quick to say, there's a very good chance you may not serve here, but with one of our affiliates. And so we're funneling people to our affiliates and saying, do you realize like you could get involved with our kids ministry once a month, but we really think your impact would be way larger if you got involved with life services in our city. And so we try to funnel people that way. So there's another example. Do you want another one, or is that good? Okay.
So with your budget selection process, I like the idea that we're going to give money to the places that need it. I think that's really smart. But my question is, how do you do that without killing innovation in places that are doing well?
That's a good question. Yeah. So how do you not squelch innovation in areas that are doing well? 2 things. It's incredibly important that everybody on our team buys into this. So my worship pastor is just as excited about this as I am. So there's a little bit of in fact, there's a guy on his team that probably we deal with frustration more because he used to work at a news station. And so he loves gear. And we're like, dude, we hired you to fix our broken stuff. Not like, you're good at like finding stuff on Craigslist. That's why we hired you. Like, that's what this guy does. So we don't buy new gear. I'm sorry, But our teams have to be 100% on board with this. So we're always talking about our anchors. The other thing is, when I mentioned that whole participation, I can get him excited about the leadership development side of what he's doing. So My worship pastor came to me a month ago and said, hey, I kind of feel bad, but I'm not on the stage for the next 5 weeks. And I looked at him, I said, you're joking right now, aren't you? Because this is what we talked about a year and a half ago when we decided that leadership development wasn't doing well. You set the goal not to improve our lights and the quality of our sound, but to multiply the number of people that could lead worship in our church, and you've done that. So that innovation's happening, but it just happens, so it's letting them participate at a level that makes sense with the anchor.
I guess you're setting innovation goals, not letting them necessarily, you're corporately setting innovation goals.
Right, and Dave was talking about echo, the whole echo thing. Weekend services are the biggest example of where we echo, and we also echo around our budgets, right? Like, we just look around and go, well, that's what they're doing. I guess we should do that, And it's like, well, why? Why would we do it? My worship pastor one day came to me, and it was like the biggest win. He said, I don't care how people worship in Australia anymore. And I was just like, can we just celebrate this moment? Like, this is so good. He's like, I just want people on the South Hill to worship God. And if it's to hymns with violin, I don't care. And I think that's part of also this whole thing is we've got to keep that vision crystal clear. It's got to be contextualized and making sure they're not looking. I always say, Christian culture, churches, we're always looking upstream to other churches. The people in our churches are never seeing upstream further than us. And so we're always looking going, oh man, if I don't do this, the people in my church, they're going to think that we're like lagging. They don't know what other people are doing. They're still listening to Lord, I lift your name on high on their way to work, Like that's truly, and that means something to them. It's okay, it's all right. So I'm just always saying, let's cut the stream off with us and let's just turn to our people and see what God's leading us to in this, Other questions about the anchors?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, your anchors are primarily for your leaders, staff leaders. These aren't something that you're sharing with the congregation.
I preach, I'm trying to every 2 years preach through them without people realizing I preach through them. So, and referencing them all the time. So when we're talking about anything that we're doing, we cast vision around why we're doing it. So if we do a parenting seminar, a 2-day seminar on parenting, we'll say, hey, one of the biggest ways that the gospel can impact you is as a parent. And we want to give you the tools and resources to be a gospel-centered parent. And so we're doing this seminar. We'd love for you to sign up. And people, so we're just always connecting with the anchors when we're casting vision and talking about why we're doing what we're doing.
So do you plan a year out, 2 years out? Do you do that
Everybody wishes that I did.
yourself, or is there a team? How do you ensure that you don't drift and not cover the things that are important and making all of this come together?
Yeah, so we're it's been crazy, and I think that's why this is important to me, because this has been an insane season trying to keep up with everything. And we've broken this into some of the natural rhythms that happen. So when we budget, you got to do an annual budget. And so the budget season is a great opportunity to just revisit this. We do staff evals at the end of the summer. And so the staff evals, after they've done their budgeting, so we're just trying to take these different things and create rhythms where we're visiting them a couple times a year. In terms of preaching schedule, I haven't had time. I write my messages at 4 a.m. on Sunday mornings, so everybody on my team wishes I could plan. We just haven't gotten to that point where I can. Right now, literally, we're as far, we're almost at a point, we might know what we're doing through the summer right now. And I'm a church planter at heart. I'm always going to be the guy that's I don't know, we were just leading all week and I forgot about the message, So I wish we got to plan stuff a little more intentionally. We're trying though, the tools and resources thing, we're trying to align some stuff. Because that's one of the things we discovered was we might not be able to get people to a seminar, but what if at the end of the message, we can get some people to church. If we can at the end of the message, what if I did 5 minutes on marriage and I did like a marriage minute thing a couple times a year? Hey, whatever, just at some point, just kind of spring. That's something that someone on my team came up with. Wait, we have this opportunity to deliver content in a way. Or what if you shot a real quick, or did a 5-minute thing and we put it on audio, CDs, and handed them out as people go out? Because people still have CD players in their cars, and we live in a place where there's cars. So We're just thinking through all those sorts of things. Can we just hand people that stuff? So we're trying to plan out a little bit more in advance, and I'm the drag on the future planning stuff a lot. You and then you.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
It sounded like you transitioned into this, right?
Yeah.
As an existing church with a set amount of people. Now, I know we're hearing success, which is awesome, and I'm getting a lot from it. But even something that's I'm kind of going through is very similar with that transitional piece. So taking a congregation of people and a set amount of number of leaders and kind of getting them together to rally around this.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
That's my third point.
Oh, so
But let me answer your question before I go to that, because it's good. So
Because I have, so we got the 5 acres, I have 4 ways of use them, you said 3 ways, but maybe dreaming and trying to go together.
yes, yeah.
Okay,
Dreaming and experimenting, they're probably one in my mind, but yeah, they're.
okay, so.
Next time I do this, it'll be 2 things. Thank you. Yeah, that's good.
So, but those are for the 4 anchors. I want to talk about running a good business.
Yeah.
That mentality of getting outside the church mentality.
This is the hard part, and Russell and I were having a conversation about this a couple of days ago, that I have let a lot of people go, and I've fired friends, like close friends, and this is a really hard thing to say. And I have a 3-fold method for making hard decisions, and it's this: make the right decision, treat people well, and walk humbly. You have to do it in that order, because if you try to walk humbly and treat people well, you'll rarely make the right decision. So the issue is for us to always look at our organizations and say, what is the right decision for us as an organization? So this is that business piece. What's the right decision for us organizationally? Once we land on that, then we determine, so what does it look like for me to treat somebody well in the process of now making this transition? And then I'm going to walk as humbly as I possibly can. So it's kind of a Micah 6:8 model as well. Like, this is sort of grounded in this. So there's an example of where when we do the resourcing and we look around, there are times that we've looked at our organization and say, like, we've changed and it doesn't make good business sense. Like, if we're just going to look at this as a business, it doesn't make sense for us to keep operating this way. So we start having really hard conversations around who's where, like what team members are here. And we had a team member. She was absolutely like one of the biggest micromanagers you've ever met in your life. We called her the corporate mother. She's 6 months younger than me, but I felt like she was my grandma. And she, like, when we first got rolling, it was just crazy, And we needed her so bad. Then we got to this point where I was sitting in a staff. She was gone. She went on a cruise. And she was gone, and we had a staff meeting, and it was the best staff meeting we'd had in forever. The next week she was back, and it was toxic. Like, nobody spoke, everybody was quiet, and I was like, oh man, we've got a serious red flag here, like this is bad. So I started observing, took like 6 months of trying to walk, I'm trying to coach, trying to do those things, and eventually I realized, like, we can't be the organization that we need to be with you here. So we had to make what was the right decision. I mean, like, this is a 15-year relationship for me. This is somebody, our kids, they have 3 daughters, I have 3 daughters. They've all gone to school together. They've done dance classes together, like embedded in community. They were mad for a little while, but they're still a part of our church and very committed, very dedicated, because we tried to treat them well and walk humbly through that process. And I told Russell, this is like the example that I used with her, because she felt like that was a condemnation on all things she'd ever done. And I said, this thing is a long relay race, and we needed you carrying the baton in the 3rd leg of this race. Like, we needed you. You passing the baton to somebody else is not a criticism on how you ran your leg of the race. You ran it well. It's just that we need somebody else to run this next leg of the race, and that's all that this really is. So that's probably an example of how we think through that the most, would be staffing, things like that. We also made some hires. This is really hard, but we hired extra administrative people for financial accountability. So this was a really hard decision to make, because we hired an additional person in our bookkeeping office because we wanted to create checks and balances so that we have ridiculous checks and balances. Like, the people that are doing things there's like no way that fraud could happen in our organization. But we had to hire and make a decision to do that when I really didn't want to, man. It would have made way more sense to hire somebody on like the front lines. But I knew if we're going to really value this, then I have to hire somebody. And so we hired someone for 15 hours a week, gave them specific bookkeeping practices that created that level of accountability within us that now there were all these checks and balances created. I didn't want to do that. Like 15 hours, I was like, man, we got a million ways we could do this, but we had to make that call. Is that those examples? Yeah. So how did we get people on board? So I got transitioned to a church that I said this, I realized this like a year later. It was a group of people, it was like somebody who fell in love with a sick patient in the hospital. And when the sick patient got better and started to walk out, they were like, wait, what are you doing? Where are you going? I love you. I fell in love with you as this sick thing. So when you go to a church that's been in decline for 14 years and there's 200 people that basically half of those people had the vision from the beginning, the other half of those people had come there because they liked the brokenness. Like, so it was this crazy thing, like where like, okay, how in the world are we going to do this? And I actually took a really different strategy, and I leaned heavily on Stephen Covey's principle, the speed of trust. And I really believe in that idea of I can only create change as fast as trust. So whatever the speed of trust is, that's the speed at which I can make and create change in the organization. Stephen Covey wrote a book that's called, I believe, if it's not, somebody correct me. I don't know, sometimes it is, yeah, it's Covey. It's a boring book. Like read the first 3 pages and you get the whole premise. I just gave it to you, basically. Here's the book. The book is this. You can only go as fast as people trust you, right? And so you have to gain trust. And so, interestingly enough, my mentor was in the exact same situation I was in 6 months before me. He took the exact opposite. He has a PhD in organizational change from Pepperdine. The guy's a brilliant man, right? He's the guy that with Mac Peer and Tim Keller, they like began getting all the denominations to focus on planting in the city years ago. So he's 6 months ahead of me, and he takes the exact opposite route, and he just starts changing stuff like crazy. And it has been, like I've been watching, it's a nightmare. Like his situation, almost identical stories, and I'm like, man, I would never choose that. So the speed of trust thing was really, really valuable for me, and he probably doesn't like that I use that as an example, but you don't know him, so it's okay. He trusts me. So speed of trust was a big part of it. So the first 6 months, I didn't do much. The first 6 months was when I was sitting in my office, staring at the ceiling going, God, how do we live this out, whether we grow or not? Like, how do we live out your gospel? How do we do this? So that's where a lot of this stuff came, was in that first little bit, because I knew, like, I can't come in guns blazing. And I knew there were things that I had to change. There was some of the non-essential things that you want to change. And I was like, there's some non-essential stuff here. I'm going to live with some cringe factor. I'm going to live with some things for the sake of credibility with the people that are here. I'm going to make some decisions to let some stuff go. But then there's stuff that it's like, no, that's a non-negotiable. That's a values violation. And I have to start creating a values culture here. So, but that really relates to the last thing. And this is funny because it sort of relates to what we're talking about. But it was more one of those things I just felt led to share with you guys. And it's totally this is the journey. So anytime there is any endeavor, whether it's a business endeavor, whether it's a change in a church, anything that we're charging out and going to do, there's this experience that I have found to be incredibly consistent among human beings. If this axis is emotions, and this axis is time, this is the experience of church planting, church turnaround, church change, any initiative you're tackling. When you begin, at the very beginning, and this is the beginning of the time of it, you start out in this place, and this is sort of how the emotions go. This is the journey that every person has. Has anybody seen this before? What's that? Algebra, yeah, exactly. It's an upside down bell curve, and this represents why you feel miserable, right? Like this is how this thing starts. So typically when we begin any endeavor, there's this first plotted point, and this is what we call unrealistic optimism. This is what you feel before you launch a church, right? I mean, this is like, David, right? You remember unrealistic optimism. It's like, we are going to change the world. Like, I think within a year, we're going to have 20 new churches and, like you just have all these dreams, right? There's this thing called unrealistic optimism. As time goes on and your experience, Mike Park's back there right now. He's going, am I an unrealistic optimism? Yes, you are right now. Right? This is your life right here. By the way, this is your future. Then you get to this place. You get to this place that we call unrealistic pessimism. So your emotional condition, you're diving, right? You're going, why did I ever sign up for this? How come I'm not, why isn't God showing up? God's not faithful. People aren't faithful. Like, my kids don't love me. Like, like everything. My dog hates me. Like, you just get to this place where everything is bad, and it is unrealistic pessimism. So you go from unrealistic optimism to unrealistic pessimism. And typically, most people stay there for a while. And we call this region down here the Valley of Despair, because we stay in this Valley of Despair it's a matter of time. And I think that's a really important thing to clue in on this. Your emotions feel this way. This is a matter of time. David mentioned Good to Great earlier. Good to Great by Jim Collins. One of the principles from Good to Great that has just hung with me forever is the idea of sustained, disciplined action in one direction. I have just believed in the church that if we just identify what we're supposed to be doing and we just stay the course and don't listen to fads and don't change prophetically every 6 months because God has a new vision for the church, if we just, God, you told us what to do, let's go do it, that something good is going to come out of this. That's just been this thing I've held on to. And what I've learned is this is just an issue of time. Interestingly enough, most businesses fail, most church planters quit, most endeavors come to their end in the Valley of Despair. So we kind of identify those first 3 or 4 years. You feel these emotions, you feel these things. That's when people go, man, I'm done. By the way, I left Brooklyn in the Valley of Despair. So the most beautiful thing I was ever a part of, the greatest endeavor that I think I've ever done, I was in the Valley of Despair and I was alone. There was nobody around me. I was isolated. I just was in this spot, I didn't know what to do. And so I pulled the plug and announced to all the people in my life what I was doing. I remember back then, the guy that was leading Hope for New York back then, I still have his voicemail. This is how sick and wrong I am. I still have his voicemail saved on iTunes because he called me and he was devastated. And he said, Brad, I just got word that you're gone, that you're moving. And it's just this long pause. And he said, man, I don't know what I could have done, but man, would you give me a call? And that was it. That was just the last, because that's what I did. Valley of Despair, just pulled the plug. I was out. So I share that to say it's time, John Tyson, how many of you guys know who John Tyson is? He was in the Redeemer Fellows program behind me, and I reconnected with John a few years ago and then listened to his story. We were both in the Valley of Despair. The difference is, I'd like to say that the only difference is, I don't have a great accent. That makes a huge difference, right? You guys know. But John just we just stuck it out. It was brutal. We were in debt up to our eyeballs and we maxed our credit cards and I didn't know how we were ever going to pay the bills and I never thought we'd get out of it. He just shared with me, he's like, yeah, we just kept grinding. And I was like, yeah, I gave up during this. So the Valley of Despair. Then you come to the other side of it. Sorry, that was a little cathartic for me. If you guys didn't notice that little verbal processing. Yeah, still working it out. You get to the other side and this is what you come to. You come to realistic optimism. And this is the beautiful thing. This also, by the way, parallels what Dave was talking about earlier, totally aligns with all those E's that he gave us. Because once you get through the desert, you know the elixir. When he said that, I was like, yes, the elixir is when you have realistic optimism. Now you say, I know what it's actually going to take for us to do this. Now I've got the time in the saddle. I have the experiences. I've seen what the land looks like. I know that there are giants there, but I also know who we are, and I know how to move into that land. That's what happens when you come to realistic optimism. You've gone time, there's distance that you've traveled, and there's emotions that you've dealt with, but you come out on the other side and you realize, okay, this is the hill that we're taking. I felt like I wanted to share this mainly to answer that question of, there still are times when I look and I go, oh man, can we keep going? Can we keep doing this? And especially early on, when people started leaving, I was sharing with somebody, we launched, so we have 4 Sunday services, but we launched a Sunday night service. We first started it, it was great because it still is. It's the thing that God uses to humble me every single week, because I end every Sunday with the smallest crowd of the day. They are the most mellow, they are the most awkward, they are the least engaged crowd. And I'm always like, this is like a church plant all over again. Like and when we first started it, there was like 100 and some people that came to this first Sunday night service. And I was like, okay, this is doable. Like, we can do this and we can make this work. You know, we're going to keep grinding. And then the Seahawks made the playoffs. Like, it was the year the Seahawks had a really great year, like a couple years ago. They had a couple of great years. We had a couple of really bad years on Sunday nights because of the Seahawks. And I hate to say it, but it was like true. And so the numbers were just like going down. Instead of strengthening what remains, we were strangling what remains. And it was just like going down. And every week it was more and more awkward. And I remember one week there was like 30 people. And then the night that the Seahawks were like in the NFC Championship or whatever, before the service we looked out, there was like 7 people. And you know, in the morning service there was like 600 people at one of the services, and now there's 7 people, and this gut-wrenching thing of like, what am I doing? You know, why are we doing this? And we just said, but we're gonna keep doing it. We know that there's a different crowd of people. We know there are people that can't come to church on Sunday morning. There are people in industries that don't allow them to be here. We just said, we're going to keep this. This is a different group that we're reaching with this service. We've got non-believers who are coming to the Sunday night service. I had friends that hadn't been in church in 35 years that were just like checking out church, and that was the most comfortable one for them to check out church in, not the cool, fun, crowded one in the morning. Because the only people that love a crowded room, by the way, are pastors. Like, when's the last time you walk into a movie theater and you're like, yes, every seat's taken but 2, right? We're the only ones that love a crowded room. Like, it's just because it boosts our ego. So we just stayed the course with that thing. And it still is like one of our smaller services on Sunday, but there's about 300 people that come to it. And now it's my favorite service of the day. It's like now the service that, like, man, this is like really fun to be a part of, and it's good, and the people, there's this community that is uniquely that community of faith. They're like their own thing, where the morning services, they're all just a bunch of consumers. My Sunday night crew is the ones that they know what we're here for, you know. But it was this thing, like we almost pulled the plug. My worship pastor, I remember that night, NFC Championship night, he's like looking at me in the back room, he's like, so do we call it? Do we just like take everybody to dinner? And I was like, no, dude, you're getting out there with your guitar and you're going to lead them in worship. 7 people came to be led in worship. They're going to experience God. That's what we do. So we're going to do that, you know. And he's like, all right, we're going to do it. I just wanted to share this sort of as the last thing, because I think that's, man, there are lots of days where I'm like, oh, this looks really steep right now. Or it just looks like it's getting lower and lower. And then to realize, like, just time, man, pressing, keeping going. Mike?
Yeah, right. How do you, when you're in that valley, right, how do you manage your emotions so that you make good decisions?
I come back to the defining a win. I tell the stories. So the stories of life change is what keeps me alive in the valley. So you have to tell those stories to somebody. So I've got a couple of friends that I can brag to because I have to tell somebody the story. I have to be able to say, man, this is so good. Like, and they know I have to be able to share the story with somebody and have somebody go, way to go, man. Like, way to go. Like, that's what this is about. So I just come back to those defining the win, man, just those 3 things and saying, is that stuff happening? And if that's happening, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep anchoring in that, you know, being centered on that whole thing. So that's why, I mean, I think if you can share the stories, even for you to like when Drew sends his email out and it tells a story of life change, I know that there's a part of me that's like, that's not just good for me to hear, that's good for Drew to say. As he's typing that out and he says, man, here's a story. When Dave shared about the woman at the conference that he had a prophetic word for, that's just as good for him to share as it is for him to do, because it was that reminder of, yes, Lord, I'm listening to you and I'm following your call, and that's what you asked me to do. So we tell those stories because we need to be reminded in the valley, you know? So genuinely, that's what it is. And then the other thing is, I take vitamin D. You know, I live in a climate. I grew up in Phoenix. And so I've lived, at a 48th or 49th parallel now for about 15 years. And I also realize that there are physiological things that can impact this. When I'm feeling down, I don't drink beer with my friends. I mean, I know that seems really, but that's like a logical thing. It's a depressant, I try to think about my body the best I can. I mean, sometimes I don't do well with that, but that's kind of a silly example. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I take vitamin D in the winter. I don't drink if I'm depressed, don't find myself, anything to try to keep myself spiritually and emotionally buoyed. I'm not going to add to the emotions. The other thing for me is I've got some people around me that will speak truth in love, but sometimes they speak truth because they speak love because they know I need it to keep going. And not all of us are the same when what we need there, but I just need some people every now and then just to go, man, way to go, like, good job, like. And so it's having some people that will just remind you of that. I've got a guy on my team that when I get really harsh critics, I have people that I have bloggers and haters. I've got trolls that troll me. And there's a guy that posts a video every week critiquing me online, just stuff like that. And Nick, one of my executive pastors, Nick says, his line is like, guy's an idiot, stop it. That's his text to me all the time. Guy's an idiot, stop it, don't listen. But that just does volumes for me when I'm like, yeah, you're right, stay the course, don't take the bait, Yeah, so that for me is how I get through it. Exercise, health, and then the stories, just sticking on those stories. Other questions? I'm a little past time, but yeah.
I might have missed this earlier, but what was the reasoning why you don't publicly share the 5 anchors?
There's not a reason that I don't. I share them through preaching and different stuff. We share them, we connect them to things. We just don't, this is bad. We don't know what our values are right now. And this sounds really funny, but one of the conversations we're having is why are we experiencing what we're experiencing? One of my long-term atheist friends announced to me last week that he said, man, can I go hang out with you? I got some questions to ask you. This is a very educated individual, very specific about his atheism. By the end of our conversation, he says, shit, I don't think I'm an atheist anymore. And I'm just like, man, this is it. We're having these experiences. This is like a normal thing. We have atheists that are signing up for Alpha at our church, which we launched Alpha, and I never thought in a million years that I'd ever do that again. I did it when it was a cartoon character with a question mark back in the late 90s, And they've revamped it, and we're seeing people come and be a part of this, and we're just blown away by what's happening. So we're having these experiences right now where we don't know what our values even are. We're trying to identify, I could write some stuff on a piece of paper and go, yeah, here's our values as a church. But I'm just looking at man, there's something else. I keep saying this. I don't know my values until I know we violated them. And when we violate them, I'm like, ooh, what's that? So I'm trying to identify those right now. So all that being said, we haven't even gotten to the point of putting our strategic anchors on something. It's really been chaotic. I mean, it's just been we're just trying to get through every week and do the stuff we're supposed to do. So, and the other thing is this. We have a sign in front of our building that just says Summit. It doesn't even say Summit Church, and we don't put the times of our services on that sign. And the reason is we don't want anybody to come to our church that isn't invited by somebody. So the only reason you're ever going to come to our church is that you came with someone. You're not going to just drive by, see it, and be attracted to it and come. The other thing that we don't, I guess maybe I'm getting deeper. The other reason we don't share our anchors is that usually the only people that really care about that are Christians. And so I'm not interested, and so we haven't done any of everyone wants us to do a quick look brochure, just a short story about, tell me about Summit. And I just keep saying to our team, the only people that want that are people that are transferring here from other churches, and I'm not here for them. So if they don't like that we don't have it, then they don't get us. So right there is a check mark against them, and that's another sign you probably shouldn't be here, that if you're concerned about going through all this stuff, dude, go to the church that does that. We're just not into that sort of thing. So that's probably why we haven't. Now that I verbal processed that, there you go, there's the answer, yeah. That's good, now I know why we haven't done that. Thank you for asking that, yeah. Any other questions? You had a question in the back there? No? You just turned around. I thought you raised your hand earlier, so that's bad when you point, no, not me. You guys, thank you, yeah.
So you didn't say these are the things, whatever, but when you were just sharing that information, that's just something how you feel, so that's just out of a heart of prayer and just your desire.
You mean the not inviting thing, the whole no number?
Yeah, all those things.
That functionally has to do with what Dave talked about, and that's my biggest. So 2 problems in the church today. One is transfer growth. I don't want to experience transfer growth. 2 is people treating the church like a spectator sport. And this is what like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, there's all these mechanisms we've put in place to move people through these systems. Like you sign up for this class, and there's 101, 201, 301. And what we realized was if you're in relationship with people, you don't need to funnel them through. So we eliminate the need for all these functional structures, as people called them back in the 90s, like Christian Schwartz and natural church development. You need these structures and these systems because people showed up and they were like, what's my game plan? We don't need all of that if they come because my friend brought me and we're here and now they're taking me, like they're just helping me move through this relationally. So for us, it's just more of a philosophical thing around how people get discipled is in relationship, not through program. So we're trying to eliminate the possibility for people sitting in the stadium and listening to watching the show. That's kind of what motivated that. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.